Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's Andrea again, your friendly TA. This is week 7, so congratulations for making it this far and talking this week about climate change and sustainability. And one of the questions for discussion is about land-based wellness. And Kate again had asked if I might be able to lean in a little bit here with some of the work that's more in my wheelhouse. And there's a really wonderful case study that I think illustrates a lot about some of the concepts that we've been talking about, but also can maybe help with your planning for the assignment 2, which is about designing a health impact assessment. So I just wanted to start off saying, I've received a lot more teachings about how the health of the land is the health of the people, and what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. And I know that there's some language that can be used about environmental burden of disease, for example, and that can be very detrimental to our relationship of and with the environment as a steward and a partner. So from some of the posts in week 6, I can really sense some of your passion about this issue, and it's something that I feel very strongly about too. And it's a really great check-in to consider how we substantiate this, not jumping to conclusions, and also be real advocates for change. So what I'd like to do is go through this case study, and just for an introduction here, this is the Mount Polley Mine disaster. This happened in 2014, and it draws together a lot of the things that we've been talking about so far. So what this particular study that I'm referring to did is there were 2 health impact assessments that were done. There was one that was done under the legislative framework that happens as a spill response that's part of an environmental assessment plan. And then there was a community-based health impact assessment that was funded by the First Nations Health Authority, and that came up with very different results. So we'll talk about both of those, and then on the second one, a little bit more about how they designed it, the findings and the results, because I think that might apply a little bit more to our talks here. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that HIA was done by Janice Chandro and her colleagues. They did an amazing job. It's a paper that you can Google just on Google Scholar, and I think if the reference isn't in here and you're interested in it, please let me know and I can send that to you. Okay. So again, situate ourselves in geography. Where are we in relation to our environment? So I'm going to see, oh, sorry, here I can use a pen. We are looking at this area here in South Central BC. And the area that we're going to be talking about, this here is the mine site. This here is the tailings pond. A tailings pond collects mine waste. So you can see this is an open pit mine. And what that means is you just dig everything up and you separate out what you want. And the stuff that you don't want is called waste rock, but you need to put that in a containment facility so that the really bad stuff settles out. And they do that by filling it in a big pond, and it settles out in water. That's what this area is. The issue that we're talking about, this tailings spill, happened right at this spot here. Okay, so we've got a bit of an idea here. Again, just a little more closely. That image was taken right about there. You can see that this is Quesnel Lake. It's a huge lake. I think it's either is the largest or is the second largest freshwater lake in BC, as it's not the largest, like the deepest lake, and that's really significant for wildlife habitat. Here's Prince George, Williams Lake, and the Fraser River follows Highway 97 here. Okay, so again, Fraser River. Now let's put this a little bit more into a watershed context. Here's BC. This is the Fraser River Basin. Here again, this is Quesnel Lake. Here is our mine site. Now, why is this important? We got to put this in the bigger picture context of when something like this happens, where are we going? What are our pathways? A watershed, just think of it kind of like a big bathtub. Everything in all of these sub-watersheds or sub-basins, any tributary, stream, river, creek, aquifer, everything is making its way to the Fraser River, which is making its way all the way down here out to Delta and then out to the Pacific Ocean. It's a gravity-fed system, and so you're going from high elevation areas to low elevation areas. This is really important when we're understanding transport of anything. And you can think back to just your own understandings of the environment when you see log booms, when you see you're standing, was it when you go like tubing and stuff like that? Just think about those things. This is just on a really giant scale. Okay, so now a bit about the situation itself, and I kind of apologize here because I see that the camera in the bottom corner is going to block out a few of these comments, but that's okay. Okay, so Mount Polley Mine, here it is again. Here's the mine. Here's the tailings pond. Now this tailings pond, 4 square kilometers. Okay, the size of this, think of a football field. Like close your eyes and think of a football field. 4 square kilometers is 125 football fields. Like, it's huge. And so the size of these, sometimes it's hard to comprehend the scale that we're talking about with these sorts of things. So this here, this is where the wall breached. And breach means it broke. I did this talk to another group, and one of the people in that group worked in maternal health, and they thought their mind went to that kind of a breach. And so it's actually not that different, but what we're talking about here is a break in a wall. And what happens there is it breaks, the wall collapses, everything drains out. The processed water that was in here, you can imagine, because we're digging up mine sediments, it was elevated in trace metals, selenium, arsenic, and of most importance here was gold and copper. Copper was in high amounts, and that wasn't the worst, but that was one of the metals that was most concerning. Okay, here's another look at this just from another angle. I don't know if this is a building right here or a truck, but you can see that this is huge. This is massive. This was a huge disaster, and I don't think anybody was killed when this happened, but that was, if not, that was a fluke. That was really lucky. Okay, so tailings pond release. August 4th, 2014, this was the first day of salmon fishing. The underlying cause of this, because you always have to go back to culpability, why did this happen, was in the engineering of the containment pond. Now, this is, again, now a little bit of jargon here. Strength of the glacial lacustrine clay. Doesn't really mean anything except glacier and lake. So that is the material that they used to build the wall was, in the end, not strong enough to withhold what was in there. Or it was strong enough to a point and it was holding too much. Or it wasn't inspected frequently enough. All of these sorts of things. What happened? How did it work for so long? And then how did it not? And then this here is just a little bit more to differentiate between what actually was spilled. A tailings pond is purposely meant as a settling pond, and so what you have is you have a layer at the top that is called supernatant water, and that's what things settle out of, and then it settles into a slurry, so just like a mud puddle. But when that wall broke, everything in it is going to rush out. And so that's going to be a mix of water, logs, construction materials, everything inside. So altogether, that was about 25 million cubic meters. That's where the number 125 football fields comes from. Okay, so here we are on our map. Here's our breach. Now, oopsies. Oh, how do I erase that? Forgive me here. Like we were saying about watershed flow, path of least resistance, it's gravity fed. What is hard to appreciate in these photos is how steep this embankment is here. And so you've got this outflow and everything, it's gonna flow out as best as it can. Mount Polley Lake, I believe it rose by about 1.5 meters. That's how much stuff fell into it. And then it also drained down Hazeltine Creek here until the rest of it spilled out into Quesnel Lake. Okay, so what happened? There was a state of emergency that was declared. This is what the protocol is. State of emergency, the village of Likely, BC, and I think it was a no drinking water advisory for 3 days. So it didn't last that long. They have defined areas where they definitely can't use it anymore, where the water quality will be permanently compromised. And then there was a temporary closure of the Chinook salmon fishery. So enter Imperial Metals, they were the owners of this mine. What did they do? They had a duty in their environmental assessment mandate that they had to do a health impact assessment when this happened. So what they did is they looked at the pre-event infrastructure issues. That's the things we were talking about the structure of the tailings feature itself. Post-event impacts to receiving environments. What that means, and it's funny, all this language, it's like, what happened in the places where the spill happened? Where do they need to be concerned for future? What's the long-term water management plan? And as you can see at the bottom, the mine resumed activities in 2016 because they felt that they had done the remedial activity that was necessary. Here is just sort of what this looks like when you're doing this sort of an assessment. You've got the mine site, and these are the areas. This is Golder Associates. They're a big consultant, and they do a lot of these kinds of programs. And they identify areas for monitoring that might be at the highest risk. So what you usually do, you do one sort of at the far end. This is where the spill happened. There's not a lot of point testing for contamination at the contamination source. So you got to put your critical thinking hat on. You know it's contaminated because that's where it happened. Where you're really concerned is how far did the contamination get? And so that's why you have these areas out here. Now, what could happen is they say, well, we don't detect anything here, so that's as far as we need to go. Or another way that these are designed is they take a radius of influence and they say, okay, we'll go out maybe like 10 kilometers and we'll look in that area. This is also all based, again, the watershed model on how the water is going to be flowing, because here in Quesnel Lake, it's connecting to the Quesnel River, and the Quesnel River flows into the Fraser River. Okay, the other important part of this, stakeholder engagement. Here's the mine. They worked with they consulted with the Soda Ash Indian Band and Williams Lake Indian Band, I think because those were the two that responded. So this is what they say. They say this on their website. You can find it. You can find it at this link. Environmental monitoring and data collection includes water chemistry. These locations. The program includes geochemical, physical limnology, that means lakes, and biological testing. So they are testing for chemicals, they're testing lakes, and they're testing fish and frogs, and I know other organisms, but usually it's fish. And so the water sampling has concluded that the affected areas were not toxic to aquatic life. Water quality information has been communicated to the local communities and stakeholders on a regular basis. Okay, really? Like 25 million cubic meters and there are no effects to aquatic life? Like it's not that I want to be suspect about this, and that's why you're saying, okay, well, jumping to conclusions, we got to be careful. So I think maybe a little bit more investigation is warranted because, as we say, only 2 stakeholders, only two First Nations that you're consulting. So this is where now we'll move into the community assessment. Because we got to remember, looking at this watershed model, not everything plays by the rules. Salmon go the other way. And so where did salmon factor into that impact assessment? Here we are again. Here's Quesnel Lake. And that's where our spill happened. All of these dotted lines are the areas where there are very sensitive salmon spawning habitat. Okay, and now the salmon, the water's flowing this way. The salmon are going the other way. is there a potential for the water that is flowing from this area to potentially interfere with the fish? So even though they may not detect these trace metals in high concentrations, fish, I think, accumulate toxins and I'm not a fish biologist, fish accumulate toxins differently than the ways that we might be testing at certain points for other parameters. Okay, and what I mean by that is if you take a water sample at one point in time, you might get nothing, and the fish might not have anything at that one point in time. But it takes time for things to build up, and so like a snapshot, like a cross-sectional snapshot, is that enough? Okay, so now the community-based health impact assessment. This was the First Nations Health Authority funded this, and I think this is where we can start to think about your assignments. This is a really great thing to go. It's like, okay, what happened was they were not satisfied with, or there was a number of groups were not satisfied with the health impact assessment. And so if we go through like the 5 W's, that's a really good way to think about how you're going to design a study. Okay, so who? They wanted to know which First Nations were impacted as determined by them. What were the impacts to Aboriginal health considering environmental, social, and culturally appropriate determinants? So now we're stepping a little bit broader. When? This was the aftermath of the Mount Polley spill, where this is to be determined from community consultation. You need to ask the community where are the points that you think need to be considered, and why. So the industry and the provincial government, they failed to implement a social or health impact assessments in response to the breach. Now, that isn't entirely true because there was a health impact assessment. It just wasn't satisfactory to the people who felt that they were affected. Okay, and how did they do this? They did a desk-based search, qualitative interviews, and community-based research methodologies. Okay, so who? They had to identify what the criteria for engagement was. They needed to be close to the mine site or situated along the Quinella-Fraser River. They had to identify what traditional land was impacted, which is actually part of our constitution. You have to consult within the territory, not just in proximity. Next, they identify people who are maybe recommended by FNHA or other nations, so doing sort of more of a snowball effect. So if one community said, you know what, you should talk to those people over there because they had some concerns, or you should talk to those people over there. It's not just in that radial approach, like who sits in this ring that I drew on a map. Okay, so of the outreach there, they found 47 communities that met this criteria. 24 responded. There was one non-First Nation community that responded as well. There was one that didn't report impacts, and there were also 16 nations that participated. What they did is they had interviews with questions that were related to the mine breach. How does this affect your personal fishing practices, impacts to traditional land use, commercial fishing, emotional impacts, those sorts of things. Okay, so what they found was that there were communities that responded 400 kilometers to the north, more than, and all the way down to the south. Remember, these were the two that Imperial Metals consulted with. The things that they reported were impacts to fishing practices, emotional stress, administrative burden, and also the physical restriction that they had from accessing the territory. These are very different than the questions that were asked in the other HIA. There's deeper impacts to this as well. And this is where we start talking about ripple effects and cumulative effects. You have a reduced physical activity. You may, if you're reliant on commercial fishing, that changes your income. There's economic effects to that, employment. There's a disruption to fish-related cultural traditions. And that's more than just being able to fish so you can eat. There's an identity that's associated with that. It interferes with the self-determination on how somebody wishes to live, right? And it's also reflective of ongoing environmental dispossession. And environmental dispossession in this context is very rooted in colonialism. It disrupts the connection of a people to their place. So what they found, the best way to frame this, is that the health of the salmon was the same as the health of the people. And that's how impacts of this spill were best understood. It is in the context of the Fraser River as a source of the salmon. These traditional activities, and these here just explore a little bit more, community gatherings. We talk about how important social networks are to health, social cohesion, the activities that you do on the land that involve cultivating a practice and seeing through to the end. There's a lot of ceremony that's associated with fishing as well. Social identity. And this here is something that's very important, and this is my area of work as well, is this passing of knowledge. You have to think, if your salmon stocks, just for example, are compromised and you're not able to fish, how are you going to teach your kids to fish? Okay, that piece of cultural continuity is so important, not only to health and wellness, but to safety of young people. And there's a number of studies, very seminal pieces, that have talked about cultural continuity and the link to Indigenous youth suicide. So these are the types of social issues that a health impact assessment designed like this can start to address. But I'm not sure that Imperial Metals had any mechanism in their framework to look at a study like that, or look at some of these issues from this perspective. Okay, so the other side, the emotional trauma of just not knowing if you were affected, so a perceived impact to wellness, that's also very stressful. And the health service providers, they were also part of the interview pool. So not just there are numerous stakeholders, and so there are the community members, but also the people that are working to support them. And there were other things that they had reported as well. This creates tensions between communities because people not knowing, people who maybe support, who don't support, and real and perceived threats to wellness. Okay, so this is just sort of a bit of a reiteration to the intro here about the land health connection. There's improved diet, improved exercise, self-esteem, mental health, identity. Those are all things that can happen when you've got that sustained and strong land health connection. But without that, and as this case study here has illustrated, there's things that come up related to different stressors, and these are not just anecdotal stories. There is real evidence about this. So, okay, so they made some main recommendations here, and this is the other part of it. Recognize salmon as a determinant of health. Okay, so this is the other thing that's really neat about talking about social determinants of health, determinants beyond the social, and looking at it also in an environmental and a geographic context. Salmon as a determinant of health. Like, think about the places where you guys are from. What would a determinant of health be that's specific to your area? Okay, another recommendation is recognizing how chronic stress is also detrimental to health. And so what support services could be in place that could help mitigate that, or help be in place ahead of time. Healthcare centers, support workers, counselors, psychologists, and not just in a reactionary way, but also in a proactive solution. And there also needs to be more advocacy, and is this something that First Nations Health Authority should be responsible for, or in consultation with community, for there to be an understanding between environmental and cultural belonging as it pertains to health. This needs to make its way up into our other legislative frameworks that talk about these sorts of investigations at the beginning. So, and these investigations being environmental assessments. Okay, so in summary, and thank you all for sticking around to this point, because I recognize that I've gone over the time a little bit. But take this forward, think, who should determine what is an impact? There is, in this case here, there's a cultural dimension to water quality that may be different for different groups of people. There is an emotional significance to having that quality compromised, and it's not as easy as just like, well, just drink bottled water. It's not enough. And addressing the roots to these impacts that can support appropriate interventions. Like a lot of communities are still healing, and they're healing in a lot of other ways. So things like this can be very triggering to other emotions and other reactions, and they can reignite them. And so are we really addressing the root causes of these issues, and what responsibilities do health impact assessments have in starting to really advocate and initiate change? So that's everything. And that was a little long, but I hope that was helpful, and I hope that can incite some good thoughts and some good considerations for some of your work moving forward, and how you're going to be considering the environment and considering the context of the environment in the discussions that you bring forward. And really looking forward to seeing the assignments and the comments about this. Thanks a lot.